When a nurse didn't show up for her shift and her coworker sounded the alarm, police jumped in quickly, not realizing just how horrific or how strange this case would get. And by the time they finally uncovered the truth, even seasoned investigators could barely believe it happened in real life. And to this day, it stands as one of the most disturbing cases on record. Tracy Wildman was born on September 29, 1966, in California. When she was 14, her parents split up, and she moved with her dad and older brother to a city called Riverside. She enrolled at the local school and made friends fast. Her next-door neighbor, Trish, became her closest friend, and Tracy also had a cousin on her dad's side living there, a girl named Tanya. The three of them spent their time roller skating, hitting the shops, and even getting into horseback riding. Later, Trish's parents divorced, and Trish's mom married Tracy's dad, so those best friends literally became family. After high school, they went through nursing training together and landed jobs as nurses. When Tracy turned 25, she married a man named Richard and moved with him to Arizona. Their daughter Kristen was born soon after, but the marriage didn't last, and they divorced. From then on, Tracy raised her daughter on her own, kept working as a nurse, and moved between a few states chasing better opportunities. She tried to visit her family in California as often as she could, especially after a brutal stretch when they lost several relatives in a short period. Her own brother and 3 half-siblings died suddenly, and Tracy's father and stepmother had to step in and take care of the children they left behind. In 2009, she got married again and moved to Tennessee, but within a year, the marriage fell apart and they divorced. Tracy headed to Alabama, where her cousin Tanya was working at a nursing home. Tanya helped her land a nursing job there, and Tracy settled in a small place not far from the facility. After the split and the move, money was tight. She had rent and bills to cover, and at first she couldn't even afford a car to get to work, so she rode the bus. She also wanted to visit her daughter, who by then was grown and living in a different state. So Tracy started putting money aside for a car. On October 13, 2010, when Tracy was 44, she didn't show up for her shift, and her co-workers were immediately worried. She'd only recently started there, but she'd already built a reputation as dependable, and she'd never missed a shift. Management called her landlord, who lived on the property, and could check on her. He went over and knocked, but no one answered. He tried a few more times, then used a spare key to open the door. Inside, he called her name, but there was only silence. He walked into Tracy's bedroom and, to his horror, found her on the floor. There was blood on her head, and he knew right away she was gone. So he ran back outside and called the police. Officers started working the scene, and quickly realized they were looking at a homicide. The victim wasn't wearing any clothes, and there were 2 stab wounds on her back, along with a lot of other injuries, including defensive wounds and a cut across her throat. The whole picture looked like she'd been tortured for hours, and detectives believed the killer took pleasure in it. Later, the medical examiner confirmed she'd died from blood loss. They also determined she'd been sexually assaulted in a brutal way, and they officially confirmed the victim was Tracy. Forensics sent samples from her body to the lab for DNA testing, along with blood collected from inside the house and other evidence. Detectives were hoping the killer had left something behind they could match, but the local lab said it would take at least a few weeks to process everything. There were no signs of forced entry, which suggested Tracy either knew her killer or he talked his way inside. In the bedroom, they found a handgun on the floor near her body, and since there were no gunshot wounds, that detail didn't make sense at first. Was it Tracy's gun and she tried to stop the murderer, or did he bring it and for some reason never use it? Detectives spoke with Tracy's family and co-workers, trying to figure out if anyone might have wanted to hurt her. They checked out her ex-husbands, but both were in other states with airtight alibis. Next, investigators started piecing together the timeline of the day before the murder, hoping for a lead. They talked to her cousin and learned that morning, Tanya's boyfriend drove both women to the nursing home to pick up their paychecks. After that, they went to the bank and cashed them. Then Tracy asked to stop by a used car lot, because she finally had enough saved to buy a car. She'd already found a model she liked on their website and wanted to see it in person. She did like it and said she planned to buy it soon. Tanya and her boyfriend dropped her back home after that, and that was the last time anyone saw her alive. Detectives also asked the family if Tracy had a gun, and Tanya's boyfriend said he was the one who'd given her one. According to him, just before she died, she'd complained about a man named Richardson who was harassing her and acting odd. He kept showing up around the place where she lived, and police tracked him down fast. He really did act suspicious, and detectives started to look at him seriously. But in the end, Richardson had a solid alibi. So investigators were back to square one. They kept talking to Tracy's relatives, and at some point, the lead detective noticed that James, Tanya's boyfriend, had a pretty deep, fresh cut on his pinky. He'd seen that kind of injury before in knife attacks. When blood slicks the handle and the knife slides in your grip, it's easy for the blade to jump and slice the attacker's own hand. When the detective asked how he got it, James said it happened doing something around the house. Still, it was hard to ignore, especially with James' handgun turning up on the bedroom floor next to Tracy's body. James denied having anything to do with the murder. He insisted that he and Tanya dropped Tracy at home, went back to their place, and stayed in for the rest of the day. Police started checking his story, and Tanya backed him up. They pulled bank camera footage and spoke with the used car lot employee. Tracy had been at all the places James mentioned, exactly when he said she was. Little by little, detectives started to doubt he was their guy, because it just didn't look like he had the window to pull this off. In the end, detectives were empty-handed again. They kept running through every man who could have possibly done it, but every lead stalled out, and after a few days, they were starting to doubt they'd ever get to the truth. The DNA results still weren't back, and out of sheer frustration, the lead detective decided to bring James in one more time. At the station, he got straight to it and asked if anything sexual had happened between him and Tracy. It's a classic move. It pins a suspect to a clear answer, and if the lab later finds his DNA on her after he's denied any sexual contact, that denial can be used against him. James insisted there was nothing romantic between them because Tracy was his girlfriend's cousin, so he never even looked at her that way. But the detective kept pressing, and eventually, to their surprise, James changed his story. He admitted that he'd had sex with Tracy that day, with Tanya there too. According to James, after they left the dealership, the three of them went back to Tracy's place, and everything that happened inside was consensual. He even walked detectives through the details, but kept saying that when it was over, he and Tanya drove home, and Tracy was fine. The only reason he kept that part from police at first, he said, was because he didn't want to embarrass Tanya, since she was Tracy's cousin. Detectives didn't buy it. With James' handgun found on the bedroom floor near Tracy's body, they figured there was a real chance he'd used it to threaten her into sex, and then killed her. But no matter how hard they pushed, he stuck to his story and kept insisting he was innocent. At one point, they asked him to take a polygraph, and he said he'd be happy to. But what was the point if those results don't hold up in court? Not long after, he shut down the interview altogether, but by then, police felt they had enough to arrest him and wait for the DNA results while he sat in jail. As for Tanya, officers took her into custody too, because she'd given James an alibi that he later blew up with his new version of events. Over the next few weeks, investigators kept working the case and waited on the lab, but the DNA still wasn't ready. About a month after Tanya and James were taken into custody, the jail staff reached out to detectives with something unexpected. An inmate wanted to talk about Tracy's murder, so the officers headed over right away. The inmate said Tanya had confessed to killing her cousin, and even gave a short rundown of what had happened. She claimed that Tanya and James went into Tracy's house. Tanya gave James a signal, and he jumped her. After that, the two of them took turns sexually assaulting her at gunpoint before James killed her. Detectives got the inmate to put it all in writing, and that's when they came up with a pretty unusual play. They wanted a confession from James and decided to bluff their way to it. They brought him in and read this out, but tweaked the wording so it sounded like Tanya herself was testifying against him, making it clear she was pinning everything on James and was ready to take the stand. To cap it off, they told him that if he owned up and showed real remorse, he might even avoid prison time. It wasn't realistic at all, obviously, but they could see he was close to breaking, and the tactic worked. James agreed to confess and started telling a story that would shake even experienced detectives. James, he and Tanya met about a month before everything happened and immediately bonded over drugs and their love for crime shows, binge-watching CSI Crime Scene Investigation. In one particular episode, there was a story about two brothers who kidnapped a woman to torture her. Right after that, James told Tanya he'd been wanting to do something like that for a long time, and she said she felt the same way. She wanted to kidnap a woman, abuse and torture her, and then kill her. From there, they started working on a plan to make those fantasies real. At first, they talked about picking a random victim at a supermarket, luring her into their car and taking her, but they decided that was too risky. So they settled on choosing someone they knew, figuring it would be easier to control her and force her to do whatever they wanted. They picked Tracy, who trusted Tanya and was grateful that she'd helped her get the nursing job. In the days leading up to the murder, James cut back sharply on drugs, so he'd be clear enough to drive and carry out the attack. One day, they drove Tracy home and were ready to act, but she didn't invite them inside. But later, when they brought her back from the car dealership, James asked to use the bathroom, and Tracy let him in. While he was there, Tanya and Tracy stood in the living room, and that's when the plan kicked off. Tanya gave the prearranged signal by slapping Tracy across the face. James immediately bolted out of the bathroom, jumped her, and Tracy blacked out. They carried the victim to the bedroom, stripped her, and waited for her to regain consciousness. Then, at gunpoint, they started forcing her to follow their commands. Tanya and James both sexually assaulted her in brutal ways, and even the detectives, who'd seen a lot, were shocked by how twisted it all was. Eventually, they moved on to what they called the final part of the plan, the killing, something that excited them both, and they never intended to leave Tracy alive. James pulled a knife and stabbed her several times in the throat and back, and as he did, he told Tracy that he was sorry, that none of it was her fault, but that she had to die. Afterward, they tried to wipe up the blood, took a shower together, and left. They had planned to burn the house down, but changed their minds at the last second because they saw some neighbors. When they got back to Tanya's place, they had sex because they were still aroused by what they'd done. As James laid it all out, detectives noticed he wasn't showing a shred of remorse. If anything, he seemed proud of what he'd done. Soon after, he and Tanya were charged with murder, kidnapping, and more. Around the same time, the lab finally finished running all the evidence, and the pair's DNA was literally everywhere on the victim's body and around the house. It took almost 4 years to get the case to trial, and James finally faced a jury in 2014. Prosecutors went for the death penalty, while his attorney fought to keep him off death row, arguing there was no proof Tracy hadn't agreed to have sex with him. He also called his relatives to testify that James had been a victim of serious abuse from an early age, the kind of trauma that leaves scars you never really shake. His mother used drugs and sold herself, disappearing for long stretches and leaving James and his sister alone. They often went without food, and it took a toll on his health. Then, his mother was murdered and he was placed in foster care, where the suffering kept going. As an adult, James spiraled into drugs and funded his habit with illegal activity, which only made his mental state worse. But a court-ordered evaluation still found he knew exactly what he was doing. At the end, the jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to death. He tried to appeal the verdict, but got nowhere. This went on until 2018, when his lawyer finally managed to arrange a new trial. The lawyer was ready to fight the death sentence, but during the proceedings, something unexpected happened. James suddenly told him to stop trying to save his life because he deserved to die. As for Tanya, prosecutors, for reasons that weren't fully explained, cut a deal that had her testify against James in exchange for life in prison instead of death. At her sentencing, she cried and said she was sorry. But Tracy's loved ones didn't buy it. Trish, Tracy's best friend since they were kids, the same Trish who used to be inseparable with Tracy and Tanya, sat through every hearing. After Tanya was sentenced, she said she didn't believe a word of that remorse, and added that Tanya had been jealous of Tracy since they were little, maybe even secretly hated her for it. In April 2025, James' sentence was carried out by lethal injection. In his final statement, he said that for 15 years, he never spoke the victim's name because he felt it would be disrespectful to her. But in those last minutes, he finally said, "Tracy, forgive me.